Hello and welcome to our second lesson in our journey through the Gospel of John. When we began John last week in our introductory comments, we said that John is quite different from the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In fact, only about 10% of John's Gospel is found in the synoptics. The other 90% is unique to John and absent from the other three Gospels. One of the differences between John and the synoptics is the miracle accounts that occur in John. The synoptics give us any number of miracle accounts, but John very carefully selects the miracles that he reports. In fact, there are only 7 pre-resurrection miracles. There's one post-resurrection, and he calls these miracles miraculous signs. Doesn't just use the word miracle, doesn't just report it. He quite frequently describes it as a sign. Now, what's the meaning of a sign anyway? Well, a sign is something that points beyond itself to some other reality. And so John is not only describing the miracle itself, but he's also using that miracle to point to a reality that is greater than the act or the miracle itself. And that tends to be, generally speaking, the identity of Jesus Christ. In other words, the sign miracles in the Gospel of John point to the divinity, to the fact that Jesus is the Son of God. And so John calls that a revelation of his glory. Now, the word glory is a word that comes from the root word for light. It literally means brightness. And so what John is reporting to us is that Jesus demonstrates for us the glory that is in God. In the very first chapter, last week, you may recall verse 14, John says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father." In other words, only God Himself, only the Son of God could show us the glory that is in God. And so that's what Jesus' life, death, and resurrection does. And among those events in Jesus' life that are particularly glorious are these miracle accounts that we have recorded in John's Gospel. So we obviously don't have time to look at all 7 of these miracle reports today in this short time together, but we'll look at 1 or 2 of them and see if we can get a little bit of a feel for how John is reporting. Now, the very first miracle that Jesus ever performed is recorded in the Gospel chapter 2, and it is, to me, it's a kind of an odd miracle for Jesus to start with. I sometimes wonder, why did Jesus choose to begin His miracle ministries with this particular event? But that's not for me to decide or to question, but it is the story of the turning of the water into wine. So let me read that for you, and then we'll talk just briefly about that. On the 3rd day, a wedding took place in Cana of Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and His disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to Him, "They have no more wine." "Dear woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My time has not yet come." Now, this is kind of a typical mother-son exchange. You know, mom is making hints here. She doesn't actually say, "Can you make some more wine?" But she's dropping hints that there's a problem here with an expectation that Jesus would do something. And Jesus says, "Not my time to do this yet." But you notice that He nevertheless goes ahead and does it. So in that sense, mom kind of wins out in this case. His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever He tells you." So she trusts Him to respond appropriately. Okay, verse 6. Nearby there stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Now, there were ceremonial washings before they ate, and it'd be upon entering the house, so forth and so on, and this was kind of water that was set aside for that purpose, as opposed to, say, drinking water. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then He told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had turned into wine. Somewhere between the filling of those jars and the pouring of it into the glasses that were taken to the master of the celebration, that water turned into wine, a very good wine, in fact. He did not realize, that is, the master of the banquet did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. I often wonder how this miracle affected them, because they knew exactly what was going on here. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the very best till now." So you have this miraculous report of ordinary water being turned into wine by the power of Jesus Christ. And John concludes this account with these words: "This is the first of his miraculous signs that Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him." So it's the first sign. It points to a reality beyond itself, that Jesus is somebody very special here. It reveals his glory, that is, that he shares the glory of God, and so the brilliance, the brightness of his life and power and love is evident there. And the result is that the disciples, who were learning to figure out who he is and to follow him, put their faith and trust in him too. So the sign confirms for those who are leaning toward faith the realities of faith. It probably doesn't, a sign probably doesn't convince those who are already skeptical, because they look for other explanations or other choices. But this is the first of the miracles that Jesus performed according to John's record. Now there's an interesting side note here, and that is that this not only demonstrates Jesus' power, it also demonstrates his authority, and that's true in many of these sign miracles. There was a pantheon of Greek gods that was quite large in those days, but the chief god was Bacchus, or he's sometimes known as Dionysius. He was the god of wine and revelry. He was the only one of the gods who was credited with making wine. And so there is an implication here that when Jesus created this wine, he was challenging Bacchus head on. He was taking on the false god pantheon that so many of the people believed in, and claiming his own authority and superiority over those gods, and particularly over Bacchus in this case. And so it's a kind of a bold and daring move on his part to establish his power and his authority. Now, the second sign miracle that is recorded in John's Gospel is over in in John chapter 4, and it is the healing of the official's son. Begins at verse 43 in chapter 4. Let me begin to read here too. Perhaps we can get a general idea as we read this one also. "After 2 days he left for Galilee. Now Jesus himself had pointed out a prophet has no honor in his own country. When he arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him. They had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, for they had also been there." At the earlier Passover feast in chapter 2, Jesus had cleansed the temple. He'd driven the money changers out of the temple, and so that was quite an eventful day. Once more he visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine. And there was there a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. "Unless you people see miraculous signs and wonders," Jesus told him, "you will never believe." But the royal official said, "Sir, come down before my child dies." It's as though this man is so genuine and just saying, "Can you please heal my son?" There's a high degree of faith expressed by this man, who came seeking out Jesus in the belief that he could heal his son, and then bringing the request. And so many of the people were following Jesus for the sideshow. They were looking for the miracles, the mysteries, the tricks, and so forth that Jesus was able to perform authentically and miraculously. But this guy was genuinely seeking the help of the Lord. And so the royal official said, "Sir, come down before my child dies." And Jesus replied, "You may go, your son will live." So there's a promise there, and the man believed Jesus. It says the man took Jesus at his word and departed. While he was still on his way, his servants met him with the news that his boy was living. When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, "The fever left him yesterday at the 7th hour." And then the father realized that this was the exact time which Jesus had said to him, "Your son will live." So all of his household believed. So he and his whole household came to Jesus Christ as a result of this miracle. That is, again, the sign character that points people toward Jesus Christ. And then this account concludes, this was the second miraculous sign that Jesus performed, having come from Judea to Galilee. So you see the faith of this official that is pretty astounding in that regard. But now what we're seeing in the account is that Jesus is extending his power and authority into the human realm, over human beings and over the illnesses and problems that beset human beings. The first was kind of an inanimate type miracle where water became wine, not to minimize that in any sense, but this is where his power is being demonstrated in the life of a person who has a real need. And so as John writes these accounts, and the others have similar characteristics, he's wanting us to consider, who is this Jesus anyway? As we read this book today, we know these accounts, we kind of take them for granted, but an early reader, a person who was reading this account for the first time, would have been enraptured with this Jesus and the power he was demonstrating, and they would have said, who is this guy anyway? And that's what John wants us to do. He wants us to grapple with the identity of Jesus. You remember at the end of his book, he says that these things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and that believing you may have life on his name. So John's whole purpose is to help us to recognize the uniqueness, the divinity, and the saving power of Jesus Christ, so that we can come to know him and experience this eternal life that he talks about throughout the book. And these signs get our attention, and they cause us to have to grapple with that and to reach a conclusion of one sort or another. Now, in each of these cases, the other miracles being the healing of the invalid at the pool of Bethesda. This is a man who had been sick for 38 years. The end result of that miracle was that Jesus was accused of making himself equal to God. And so John's raising the questions, is that possible? Could Jesus really be equal to God? The fourth miracle is the feeding of the 5,000, which is the only miracle that's in all four Gospels. And we see this power to create, and again people are grappling with, is he the prophet? Who is he that's supposed to come? Then there's the miracle of the walking on the water, which shows Jesus' divine power over nature. There's the healing in chapter 9 of a man who was born blind, and that that account addresses the issue of the relationship between sickness and sin. And in a nutshell, Jesus basically denies that this man's personal sickness is a result of his personal sin. There's no connection there, he says, but the sickness is present so that God's glory can be demonstrated in the man's life. And then the man shares his testimony that concludes so wonderfully as they're arguing about who he is. The Pharisees are arguing about who this Jesus is and how he's doing this. And the man says, I don't know, I'm not a theologian, but this is what I do know. I used to be blind and now I can see. And that kind of a powerful testimony, a personal story, is pretty hard to refute. And people can listen to it, but they can't out-argue it. They can maybe conclude that there are other explanations, but they just kind of have to accept it for what it is. And then there finally is the account in chapter 11 of the raising of Lazarus, which is an amazing miracle. And Jesus says to Martha in the midst of that dialogue, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. So Jesus there very clearly demonstrates his power and authority over death itself, over our worst enemy, over death. And this account is kind of a preparatory for the death and resurrection of Jesus himself, as God miraculously raises him up from the tomb. So that these are the 7 signs that are recorded in the Gospel of John. And again, they keep pointing to the uniqueness, to the glory, to the brightness, to the special character of who Jesus Christ is. And then they call us to faith in this Christ, that we might receive the eternal life that he brings. It's interesting, at the very end of this Gospel, John makes the comment that Jesus did many other things than are recorded in this book. So I suppose that would mean that John is acknowledging that Jesus performed many other miracles that he has not recorded. And John says, if every one of these things were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that could be written. But he's chosen these, and the things he has written, again, are there so that we may know that Jesus is the Son of God and believe in him and have life in his name. I hope you're experiencing that life, and I pray that Jesus is blessing you with his presence, love, and joy these days. We'll see you next week. God bless.